Near the sun-bleached canyon walls, she saw the ground buckling, as if something was trying to break through the surface. The realization didn't come all at once. It started as a feeling, an instinct sharpened by weeks alone in the wasteland. Maya had learned to read the desert the way sailors read the sea, searching for signs of danger in every shift of sand, every change in the wind. And right now, everything was wrong. The canyon stretched before her like a wound carved into the earth, its walls rising in jagged towers of cream and rust-colored stone. She'd been tracking along its western rim for 3 days, following what she hoped was a route toward water. Her lips were cracked and bleeding. Her canteen held maybe 2 swallows of liquid that tasted more like dust than anything that could sustain life. The sun hammered down with the weight of a physical thing, turning the air into something thick and hostile that burned with each breath. But it wasn't the heat that made her stop. It wasn't the thirst or the exhaustion that had settled into her bones like lead. It was the ground. Maya stood at the canyon's edge, one hand shading her eyes, and watched the sand ripple. Not from wind. There was no wind. The air hung dead and still, so motionless that even the heat mirages seemed frozen in place. But the ground moved anyway, shifting in slow waves that traveled across the desert floor like something breathing beneath a blanket. She dropped to one knee, ignoring the spike of pain from her injured leg. The wound on her thigh had stopped bleeding 2 days ago, but infection was setting in. She could feel the heat radiating from it, separate from the desert's heat, a deeper fire that spoke of poison spreading through her system. But that could wait. Everything could wait except understanding what was happening in front of her. The buckling ran in lines, parallel ridges that emerged from the sand and then sank again, moving with purpose. Not random, not natural. Something underneath was pushing up, testing the surface, searching. The ridges converged toward the canyon wall about 100 yards to her left, where the stone face showed dark streaks of mineral deposits and ancient water stains from a time when this place knew rain. Maya's throat constricted. She'd seen things in the desert that defied explanation, ruins that shouldn't exist, symbols carved into stone by people who'd tried to warn those who came after. And she'd seen the evidence of what lived beneath, the collapsed sinkholes, the tunnels, the places where the sand suddenly dropped away into darkness that went down farther than any light could reach. But she'd never seen one trying to surface. Her hand moved to the knife at her belt, a reflexive gesture that brought no comfort. What good was a blade against something that could move the earth itself? Still, the weight of it grounded her, reminded her that she'd survived this long by trusting her instincts and refusing to give up, even when everything screamed at her to run. The buckling intensified. Sand cascaded down the canyon wall as the ridges grew more pronounced, rising higher, pushing harder. Cracks appeared in the desert floor, thin dark lines that spread like lightning frozen in stone. Through those cracks came a sound, low, rhythmic, like breathing but too slow, too deep. Each exhalation stirred dust into the air, and Maya could smell something rising from below. Wet earth, decay, something organic and ancient and fundamentally wrong. She should leave. Every survival instinct she possessed screamed at her to turn around and put as much distance as possible between herself and whatever was down there. But Maya stayed rooted in place, watching, because she'd learned something else in her time in the desert. Knowledge was survival. Understanding the threats meant knowing how to avoid them. And if something this massive was emerging, she needed to know what it was, what it wanted, where it would go. Because if it was hunting, she needed to know if she was prey. The sun continued its arc across the bleached sky, indifferent to the drama unfolding below. Maya's shadow stretched long and thin beside her, a dark companion that offered no shade, no relief. Sweat had long since stopped forming on her skin. Her body had nothing left to spare. Dehydration was making her head pound, turning her thoughts sluggish, but she forced herself to focus, to observe, to record every detail in memory. The ridges were moving in a spiral pattern now, circling inward toward the canyon wall. Whatever was below was methodical, intelligent. It wasn't just pushing blindly toward the surface. It was probing, testing, finding the weakest point in the stone and sand above, looking for the path of least resistance. A chunk of the canyon wall suddenly gave way, tumbling down in a shower of rock and dust. The collapse revealed darkness behind it, a void in the stone that hadn't been there moments before. And from that void came movement. At first, Maya thought it was a trick of the light. The shadows seemed to writhe and pulse, darker than they should be, as if the darkness itself was alive. But then something emerged, and she understood with a cold certainty that this was no illusion. It looked like a limb, but wrong in every dimension. Segmented like an insect's leg, but massive, each section as thick as a tree trunk, and covered in something that glistened wetly in the harsh sunlight. The surface was dark, almost black, but shot through with veins of pale color that pulsed rhythmically. Where it touched the canyon wall, the stone cracked and crumbled as if the contact itself was corrosive. The limb extended further, revealing more segments, each one moving with disturbing flexibility. At its end were appendages. She couldn't call them fingers or claws, because they were neither and both. They flexed and curled, scraping against the stone, and where they touched, they left marks that steamed in the heat. Maya felt her breath catch. This wasn't like the smaller creatures she'd encountered in the tunnels, the scavengers and parasites that haunted the underground passages. This was something else entirely. Something that had been down there so long it had evolved beyond anything that walked on the surface. How deep did you have to go before the rules changed this much? How long did you have to be buried before you became something like this? More of the canyon wall collapsed, and a second limb emerged, then a third. They worked in coordination, pulling, leveraging, widening the opening. Rocks the size of a person tumbled down, crashing into the canyon floor far below with impacts that echoed like thunder. Dust rose in massive clouds, turning the air brown and thick. Through it all, that breathing sound continued, slow, rhythmic, patient, as if the creature had all the time in the world. Maya's injured leg gave a sharp throb, reminding her that she didn't have that luxury. The infection was spreading. She could feel it traveling up her thigh, tendrils of poison reaching toward her core. Soon the fever would come, and with it the delirium, the confusion, the slow slide into unconsciousness. She'd seen it happen to others in the desert. Hell, she'd almost let it happen to herself once before, back when she still traveled with others, back before she learned that in this place, companions just meant more people to bury. She needed water. She needed medicine. She needed shelter from the sun and time to treat the wound. But more than any of that, she needed information. Because if creatures this size were emerging, if they were coming to the surface after whatever eternity they'd spent below, then the entire balance of the desert was shifting. The rules she'd learned were becoming obsolete, and that meant everywhere was potentially unsafe. Nowhere was safe anymore. It was just a question of degrees of danger. The hole in the canyon wall had grown large enough now that Maya could see deeper into the darkness beyond. The three limbs continued their work, bracing against the stone, pulling. And in that void, she caught glimpses of something larger, a mass that filled the tunnel behind the opening, something so huge that what she was seeing was just a fraction of the whole. How big was it? How much of it was still underground? The questions made her dizzy, or maybe that was the dehydration. She swayed on her feet, caught herself, forced her eyes to focus. Details. She needed details. The limbs were segmented, yes, but the segments weren't uniform. They grew smaller toward the ends, suggesting a tapered design. The pulsing veins, were they circulatory, neural, something else entirely? The way it moved suggested a radial symmetry, like a starfish but vertical, built for pulling itself through solid stone. A burrower, that's what it was. Something designed to tunnel through the earth, to carve passages through stone and sand. But why surface now? What had changed? The desert had been quiet for weeks. The usual signs of underground activity reduced to almost nothing. She'd assumed it was a good thing, a sign that she could travel with less caution. But now she understood. It hadn't been absence. It had been preparation. They were all moving, all coming up. The thought hit her like a physical blow. If this was happening here, it was happening elsewhere. All across the desert, these things were emerging, driven by some impulse she couldn't fathom. Migration, breeding, escape from something even deeper, even worse. It didn't matter. What mattered was that the surface was about to become a battlefield, and she was standing in the middle of it. The creature's limbs swept suddenly to the side, and Maya flinched, reaching for her knife even though the gesture was pointless. But the movement wasn't directed at her. It was clearing debris, pushing away the fallen stone to widen the opening further. The canyon wall groaned, a deep grinding sound that vibrated through the ground and up through her boots. More cracks appeared, spreading like a spiderweb across the stone face. It was almost through. Maya took a step back, then another. Her injured leg buckled and she went down hard on one knee, gasping as pain flared white-hot through her thigh. The world tilted, went gray at the edges. She could taste copper in her mouth. She'd bitten her tongue. Blood mixed with dust, creating a paste that clogged her throat. Get up, move, run. But her body refused to obey. The infection had sapped more of her strength than she'd realized. 3 days with minimal water. 6 days since her last real meal. A lizard she'd caught and eaten raw because she had no way to make fire. 2 weeks since she'd slept more than a few hours at a time. Always alert for danger. Always ready to move. It had all accumulated. A debt of exhaustion that was finally coming due. She couldn't run. She couldn't even stand. So she watched. The canyon wall gave way all at once. A massive section simply sliding free and tumbling into the depths. The sound was tremendous. A roar that echoed for seconds, rebounding off the far wall of the canyon and back again. Dust exploded outward in a wave, washing over Maya and coating her in a layer of grit that filled her nose and mouth. Through the haze, she saw it emerge. The body was cylindrical, segmented like the limbs, but so much larger. Each segment was easily 10 feet in diameter, covered in that same black-veined surface that glistened wetly despite the dry air. It pulled itself up and out with disturbing ease. The limbs. She could see now there were 6 of them, arranged in a radial pattern around the front segment, gripping and releasing, hauling the mass forward. At the front of the body, where a head should be, was instead a ring of what looked like sensory organs, pale, translucent bulbs that swiveled independently, each one catching and reflecting the harsh sunlight in rainbow patterns. No eyes that she could see, no mouth, nothing that suggested how it fed or communicated. Just those organs, scanning, processing, understanding the world in ways she couldn't comprehend. The creature was perhaps 40 feet long from what she could see, but more was still emerging. 50 feet, 60. It seemed endless, segment after segment pulling free from the tunnel. The weight of it should have been enormous, should have made each movement labored, but it moved with a kind of horrible grace, as if the laws of physics bent around it. Finally, the last segment appeared. At the rear, instead of more limbs, was something else, a cluster of smaller appendages, hundreds of them, writhing like the tendrils of a sea anemone. They dragged across the stone, leaving those same steaming marks, and Maya understood with sick certainty that this was how it dissolved rock, how it carved its tunnels, not through physical force alone, but through chemical dissolution, breaking down the stone at a molecular level. The creature paused at the canyon's edge, its sensory organs swiveling. For a terrible moment, Maya was convinced it was looking at her, that those alien senses had locked onto her presence. She held her breath, didn't move, didn't even blink. Just a rock, she told herself. Just another stone in the desert. But then the organs turned away, focusing instead on the open desert beyond the canyon. The creature's limbs flexed, testing the ground, and then it began to move. Not down into the canyon, but along its rim, parallel to the route Maya had been following. It was heading the same direction she'd been going, toward water. The realization brought a bitter laugh to her cracked lips. Of course, even something like this needed water. Maybe not to drink, who knew how it sustained itself, but for some other purpose. To breed, maybe. To molt. To complete some stage of its life cycle that required liquid. The desert had once been an ocean, millions of years ago. These things might remember that in some genetic way, might be drawn to water by instinct older than mammalian life, which meant anywhere there was water, there would be these creatures, which meant she was walking into a convergence. Maya tried again to stand, and this time managed it, though she had to brace one hand against a boulder to keep from falling. The creature was already 100 yards away, moving with surprising speed for something so large. Its passage left a trail in the sand, deep impressions where the limbs had touched down, and that disturbing wet residue that caught the light. She needed to follow it, not closely, God, not closely, but enough to track where it was going, because if she knew where the creatures were concentrating, she could avoid those areas, find a different route to water, or better yet, find evidence of how other travelers had survived, back before the desert had swallowed everything. The ruins she'd found, the warnings carved in stone, they all suggested people had lived here once despite the threats. They'd found a way. She could too, if she didn't die of infection or thirst first. Maya began to walk, keeping the creature in sight, but maintaining distance. Each step sent jolts of pain through her injured leg, and she could feel the wound weeping, soaking the makeshift bandage she'd tied around it. The fabric had once been part of her shirt. Now it was just bloody rags, inadequate and filthy. She needed to clean it, needed antiseptic, needed stitches, needed a dozen things she didn't have and couldn't get. So she walked, and she watched, and she survived. Because that's what she did. That's who she'd become. The sun climbed higher, then began its descent. The creature never stopped moving, never showed signs of fatigue. Maya's shadow stretched long behind her, a reminder of how much daylight remained. Soon it would be night, and night in the desert brought its own dangers. The cold that could kill as surely as the heat, the creatures that emerged from their burrows when the sun was gone, the darkness that could hide anything. But night also brought the stars, and the stars were how she navigated when everything else failed. She'd learned the constellations, memorized the patterns that would lead her toward zones where humans had once lived, where ruins still stood, where water might still flow underground. It wasn't much, but it was something. The creature reached a section where the canyon widened, opening into a natural amphitheater where the walls stepped back in terraces of layered stone. It paused there, its sensory organs swiveling again, and then it began to dig. The tendrils at its rear end attacked the ground with disturbing efficiency, dissolving the sand and stone, creating a new opening. Within minutes, it had carved a tunnel large enough to accommodate its bulk, and then it simply flowed into the opening and disappeared, pulling its massive body down into the earth. Within moments, there was nothing left but the hole and the trail of disturbed ground leading to it. Maya stood at the rim of the new tunnel, staring down into darkness that seemed to have no bottom. The breathing sound had stopped. The buckling ground had gone still. It was as if the creature had never existed, as if she'd hallucinated the entire encounter, except for the hole, and the marks, and the changed landscape. She knelt at the tunnel's edge, careful not to get too close to the residue that still steamed slightly in the cooling air. The stone around the opening was smooth, almost glassy, where the chemical dissolution had transformed its structure. This wasn't like the natural caves and passages she'd found elsewhere. This was made, created, shaped by purpose. And now, it was another entrance to the world below. Maya pulled out the small notebook she kept in her pack, one of the few items she'd managed to save from her journey's beginning, before everything went wrong. The pages were stained and dog-eared, filled with sketches and observations. She added a new entry: location, description of the creature, direction of travel, the new tunnel entrance. Information that might save her life later, or might save someone else's, if anyone ever found the notebook after she was gone. Then she stood, tested her weight on the injured leg, and started walking again. The creature had been heading northeast. She would go west, toward where the old maps, the ones drawn before the disaster, suggested there had once been settlements, places where people had built on high ground, where they'd dug wells deep enough to reach aquifers that might still flow. It was a long shot. Everything in the desert was a long shot, but she'd beaten long odds before. The sun touched the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and red that reflected off the canyon walls and made the whole world look like it was on fire. Maya allowed herself a moment to appreciate the beauty of it. In the wasteland, you took beauty where you found it, because there was so damn little of it. The sunsets, the stars, the rare moments when the wind blew just right and carried the scent of something other than dust. Small mercies, small moments of grace. Then the moment passed, and she was just a woman alone in the desert again, injured and running out of time, walking away from one danger and toward others unknown. The night came fast, the way it always did in the desert. One moment there was light, and the next there was darkness so complete it felt solid. Maya stopped walking and set up what passed for camp, a flat section of ground that wasn't obviously near any holes or burrows, where she could see in all directions. No fire. Fire attracted attention, and attention was the last thing she wanted. Just her pack as a pillow, her body wrapped in a thin emergency blanket that did almost nothing against the cold, but was better than nothing. She cleaned her wound as best she could with the last of her water, using sand to scrub away the dried blood and pus. The infection was worse than she'd thought. The edges of the wound were hot and puffy, red streaks extending up her thigh toward her groin. Sepsis. She probably had days at most before it overwhelmed her system. Maybe less. Maya wrapped it in the cleanest piece of cloth she had, a strip torn from her spare shirt, and tied it tight. Then she lay back and stared up at the stars. They were extraordinary tonight, undimmed by any light pollution, so numerous that the sky looked more white than black. She found Cassiopeia, traced the line to Polaris, confirmed her orientation. Northeast would take her deeper into the region where the creatures seemed to be converging. West led toward the old settlements, but also toward rougher terrain, where the canyons became labyrinths, and the stone formations created natural mazes that were easy to get lost in. South was the way she'd come. Territory she knew, but also territory she'd exhausted. No water, no food, nothing but more of the same wasteland. North led toward the regions marked on the old maps with symbols she didn't understand. Warnings, she assumed. Places that even the ancients had avoided. Every direction was dangerous. Every choice could kill her. So she'd choose the one that offered a chance of water. West it was. Maya closed her eyes, let the cold seep into her bones, and tried to sleep. But sleep was elusive, chased away by pain, and the image of that creature emerging from stone, of those limbs pulling and pulling, of the way the darkness had seemed to pour out of that tunnel like liquid shadow. How many of them were down there? Hundreds? Thousands? And what were they escaping from? If they were willing to come to the surface despite how hostile it was, what lived even deeper that could threaten things like that? The questions chased themselves around her mind until she finally slipped into an uneasy doze, the kind of half-sleep where part of her stayed alert, listening for danger. It had kept her alive this long. She had to trust it would work again. When she woke, the sun was already up, and she'd lost hours. The emergency blanket was coated in frost. Her breath had frozen on it during the night, which meant she was more dehydrated than she'd realized. Her body was conserving so much moisture that even the vapor of her breathing had become precious. Maya forced herself upright, gasping as pain lanced through her injured leg. The wound felt worse, the heat radiating from it more intense. She unwrapped the bandage and immediately wished she hadn't. The red streaks had extended further, and there was a smell now, sweet and rotten. Necrosis. The tissue was dying. She needed to clean it again. But she had no water. She needed antibiotics. But she had no medicine. She needed rest. But staying still meant dying. So, she stood up, wrapped the wound again, and started walking west. The landscape changed as she traveled. The canyon that had dominated the terrain for days began to branch and subdivide, creating a network of smaller ravines and washes. The walls grew taller, the passages narrower. Stone formations rose like towers, wind-carved hoodoos and balanced rocks that looked precarious, but had stood for millennia. It was beautiful in a harsh way, architecture created by erosion and time, but it was also disorienting. Every turn looked the same. Every passage could lead to a dead end. Maya marked her route as she went, piling small cairns of stones at intersections, scratching arrows into soft sandstone, breadcrumbs that would let her retrace her steps if necessary. If she lived that long. By midday, the fever had started. She could feel it building in her core, a fire separate from the sun's heat. Her thoughts became sluggish, slipping away before she could grab them. She found herself stopping for no reason, staring at the stone walls, forgetting why she was there or where she was going. Focus. Water. Find water. She resumed walking, her gait unsteady now. The injured leg was swollen, the flesh tight and hot. Each step was agony. But stopping would be worse. The sound of water came so suddenly that at first she thought it was an auditory hallucination, a rushing, bubbling noise that seemed impossible in this dry place. Maya stopped, tilted her head, listened. There, faint but unmistakable, water moving over stone. She followed the sound through a narrow passage that forced her to turn sideways, scraping her shoulders on the rough walls. The passage opened into a wider chamber where sunlight filtered down through a crack in the rock above, illuminating what looked like a miracle. A spring, water welling up from some underground source, filling a basin carved into the stone, then overflowing and disappearing through a crack in the floor. The water was clear, cold, absolutely real. Maya fell to her knees beside it, cupped her hands, and drank. The water was mineral heavy, slightly bitter, but it was the most delicious thing she'd ever tasted. She drank until her stomach hurt, then drank more. Then she splashed it on her face, her neck, let it soak into her clothes. The relief was immediate and profound, cutting through the fog of fever like a blade. Only then did she notice she wasn't alone. The realization came slowly, filtering through the delirium. There were marks on the stone around the spring, not natural erosion, but deliberate carvings, symbols she'd seen before, in other ruins, warnings, and there was a smell, that wet earth, decay organic smell she'd encountered at the canyon when the creature emerged. Maya's hand went to her knife as she turned. scanning the chamber. The light from above didn't reach the corners, leaving pools of shadow that could hide anything. But nothing moved. No breathing sound. No buckling ground. Just the marks and the smell. She looked more closely at the symbols. They were arranged in a pattern around the spring, a circle of pictographs that told a story. Figures, creatures, lines representing underground passages. And in the center, a warning symbol she'd seen dozens of times, a spiral with radiating lines. Danger below. The spring was fed from beneath, from the tunnels, from their territory. Maya backed away from the water, her brief moment of relief evaporating. Of course it wasn't safe. Nothing in the desert was safe. The spring was probably a trap, or at least a meeting point. The creatures would need water too. They'd come here eventually, drawn by the same instinct that had guided her. But she'd drunk deeply, filled her body with the moisture it desperately needed, and her canteen was full again, water sloshing in it with a weight that felt like wealth. She could afford to leave now, to put distance between herself and this place before anything arrived. Maya turned to go and her injured leg gave out completely. She went down hard, striking her knee on stone, and the pain was so intense that darkness washed over her vision. When it cleared, she was lying on her side, gasping, staring at the crack where the overflow water disappeared into the floor. From that crack came sound, the breathing sound, slow, rhythmic, close. They were below her, right below her. The spring chamber must sit directly above their tunnels, and the sound traveled up through the stone with nothing to muffle it. How many? 1? 10? 100? Maya tried to stand and failed. The leg wouldn't take her weight anymore. The infection had won, turning muscle and tendon into useless meat. She could crawl maybe, but not fast enough, not far enough. The breathing continued, steady and patient, waiting. No, not waiting, moving, coming closer. The crack in the floor widened with a sound like breaking bones. Stone shifted, ground against itself. Dust poured upward in a geyser, and through the expanding opening came that darkness that moved, that suggestion of something massive rising from below. Maya dragged herself backward, using her arms and her good leg, ignoring the way her wounded leg left a streak of blood and pus on the stone. She reached the narrow passage she'd entered through and pulled herself into it, wedging her body into the gap. If the creatures were as large as the one she'd seen at the canyon, they wouldn't be able to follow. The passage was too narrow. She'd be safe, unless there were smaller ones, unless they had young, unless her assumptions about their size were completely wrong. The floor of the chamber heaved upward, and something emerged. Not like before. No slow, deliberate widening of the opening. This was explosive, violent, stone erupting outward as the creature forced its way through by sheer strength. The spring basin shattered, water cascading everywhere, turning the chamber floor into a shallow pond. Through the spray and dust, Maya saw it. Smaller than the one at the canyon, maybe 20 feet long instead of 60, but otherwise similar. Segmented body, radial limbs, those sensory organs swiveling at the front. It pulled itself fully into the chamber and paused, organs scanning. Then it turned toward the passage where Maya hid, the organs fixed on her. No eyes, but she could feel the weight of its attention, the cold awareness that something intelligent and utterly alien had become conscious of her presence. For a long moment, nothing happened. Maya held her breath, didn't move, prayed that maybe it couldn't fit, couldn't follow. Then the creature's front segment began to compress. The limbs folded inward, drawing closer to the body. The whole thing made itself smaller, more streamlined, and it began to slide forward, into the passage, coming toward her. Maya screamed, couldn't help it, the sound tearing from her throat without thought. Then she was moving, dragging herself deeper into the passage despite the pain, despite the impossibility of escape. Survival instinct overrode everything else, drowning out logic and fear alike in the single imperative: move, move, keep moving. The passage twisted, branched. She took the narrower fork, hoping it would be too small for the creature. Behind her, she could hear it following, its body scraping against stone, the sound of something flexible forcing itself through a space designed for nothing its size. The passage opened suddenly into another chamber, this one smaller, darker. Maya pulled herself through and looked for exits. There, another crack in the wall, even narrower than the passage she'd come through. She wedged herself into it, pulled, felt stone scrape her ribs, her hips. For a terrible moment she thought she was stuck. that she'd become trapped in the stone like an insect in amber. Then she was through, tumbling out into a space that was more tunnel than chamber. Low ceiling, rough floor, and ahead, in the distance, a glow, natural light, an exit. Maya crawled toward it, no longer caring about the leg, about the infection, about anything except reaching that light. Behind her, the scraping sound continued, growing fainter. Either the creature couldn't follow through the narrow crack, or it had given up, or it was finding another route. The tunnel sloped upward, growing steeper. Maya's arms burned with effort as she hauled herself forward. The light grew brighter, and she could feel air moving. A breeze. Impossible and wonderful. Wind meant an opening, an exit, freedom. She emerged onto a ledge high on a canyon wall, the sudden brightness making her eyes water. Below stretched more desert, but different from what she'd traveled through. Less sand, more stone. And in the distance, barely visible through the heat haze, something that might have been structures, ruins, the old settlements. Maya lay on the ledge, gasping, her body a tapestry of pain. But she'd made it. She'd found water, however briefly. She'd escaped the creature. She was still alive, for now. She allowed herself 5 minutes of rest, no more. Then she began the slow, agonizing process of descending the canyon wall, using cracks and ledges as handholds, moving more by determination than strength. Her injured leg was useless, a liability she had to drag along, but her arms were still strong. Her will was still intact. She wouldn't die here, not today. The descent took hours. By the time Maya reached the canyon floor, the sun was setting again, painting everything in those same reds and oranges. She found a sheltered spot against the wall, out of the wind, and collapsed. The ruins were perhaps a mile away. She could make that. Tomorrow, after rest. She pulled out her notebook, her hands shaking, and added new entries. The spring, the smaller creature, the narrow passages. Information bought with pain and terror. Maybe someone would find it useful someday. Then she looked at her wounded leg in the fading light. The infection had spread further, the red streaks now reaching above her knee. Her whole thigh was swollen, hot to the touch, and the smell was worse, strong enough that she didn't need to unwrap the bandage to know what she'd find. She was dying. Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but soon. The infection would reach her blood, her heart, her brain. She'd become delirious, then unconscious, then gone, unless the ruins held something. Medicine, supplies, some remnant of the people who'd lived here before. It was a long shot. Everything was a long shot. But she'd beaten long odds before. Maya wrapped herself in her emergency blanket, now tattered and torn from the day's abuse. She drank from her canteen, the water tasting like minerals and stone but precious beyond measure. Then she lay back and watched the stars emerge, one by one, marking the familiar patterns that had guided her this far. Tomorrow she'd reach the ruins. Tomorrow she'd search for supplies. Tomorrow she'd decide what to do about the leg, about the infection, about the impossible choice between amputation and death. Tomorrow, always tomorrow. For tonight, she'd survived. And in the desert, survival was enough. The night passed in fragments. Maya would wake, shivering despite the blanket, her body alternating between chills and fever sweats. Each time she woke, she'd check her surroundings, confirm she was still alone, still safe. Then she'd drift back into uneasy sleep, filled with dreams of darkness rising and stone cracking, and that breathing sound echoing through endless tunnels. When dawn came, it was almost a relief. Maya forced herself upright, biting back a groan, as her wounded leg sent waves of pain through her system. The limb was a disaster, swollen to almost twice its normal size, the skin stretched tight and shiny. When she unwrapped the bandage, the smell made her gag, but she cleaned it again, using precious water, and wrapped it in the last clean cloth she had. Then she looked toward the ruins. In the morning light, they were more clearly defined. Structures of stacked stone, partially collapsed but still recognizable as buildings. She could make out at least a dozen separate structures, arranged around what might have been a central plaza or courtyard. No signs of life, no movement, just ancient architecture slowly returning to the desert. But where there were buildings, there might be supplies, water cisterns, storage rooms, maybe even a medical cache, if she was incredibly lucky. Maya began the journey toward them, using her knife as a walking stick, putting all her weight on her good leg. Progress was slow. Every few steps, she had to pause and rest, leaning against boulders or simply dropping to sit on the sand. The sun climbed higher, bringing its oppressive heat. The water in her canteen grew warm, then hot. She drank it anyway, forcing herself to take small sips, rather than gulping it down. By midday, she'd covered half the distance. The ruins loomed larger now, and she could see more detail. The stone was similar to the canyon walls, that same cream and rust color, layered and weathered. But the buildings showed craftsmanship, windows and doorways carved with precision, symbols etched into lintels and thresholds. These weren't primitive shelters. This had been a real settlement, a community. What had happened to them? Had they abandoned the place voluntarily, or had something driven them out? The desert was littered with abandoned settlements, remnants of when this region had been more hospitable. But some abandonment was planned, organized, and some was flight. Maya reached the first building in late afternoon. It was single-story, rectangular, with most of its roof intact. The entrance was a low doorway that she had to duck to enter, stepping from blazing sunlight into cool shadow. Her eyes took a moment to adjust, and then she saw the interior. Empty. Completely empty. Not even debris. The floor was swept clean, the walls bare. Whatever had been here had been removed systematically, deliberately. The building had been stripped before it was abandoned. She moved to the next structure. Same story, and the next. Each one empty, cleaned out, abandoned with purpose. But in the 7th building, she found something different. The structure was larger than the others, with multiple rooms, and in the back room, sealed behind a door that had been wedged shut with stones, was a cache. Not supplies, not medicine, but information. The room was filled with stone tablets, dozens of them, arranged in careful stacks against the walls. Each tablet was covered in carved symbols. Some she recognized from her travels, others completely new. And in the center of the room was a single large tablet, standing upright, with a carved image that made Maya's blood run cold. It showed the creature she'd seen, or something very like it, massive, segmented, with those radial limbs and sensory organs. But the image showed multiple creatures, dozens of them, all converging on the surface, and above them, carved with deep gouges that spoke of urgency or fear, was a date. Maya couldn't read the ancient calendar system, but she could count. And if she was interpreting it correctly, the date was recent, very recent. This wasn't a historical record. It was a prediction, a warning. The people who'd lived here hadn't just abandoned their settlement. They'd seen this coming. They'd known the creatures would emerge, would reclaim the surface, and they'd fled, leaving behind this message for anyone who came after. We warned you. We told you what was coming. We tried to stop it, but we failed. Maya sank down onto the stone floor, her back against the wall, staring at the carved tablet. How long ago had it been created? Weeks? Months? And how had they known? Had they detected seismic activity, chemical changes in the groundwater, or had they possessed knowledge passed down through generations, ancient wisdom about the cycles of the things that lived below? It didn't matter. What mattered was that they'd been right. The creatures were emerging. The desert was changing. And anyone who stayed on the surface was in danger. But there was nowhere else to go. The desert stretched for hundreds of miles in every direction. Leaving meant crossing it, and crossing it meant surviving long enough to reach whatever lay beyond. And Maya couldn't even walk anymore. She was trapped. The realization should have brought despair. Instead, it brought clarity. If she couldn't run, she had to adapt. If the surface was becoming the creature's territory, she needed to understand their patterns, their behavior, their weaknesses. She needed to become not prey, but something they would ignore, or something they would fear. Maya pulled out her notebook and began sketching the carved image, recording every detail. The way the creatures were arranged suggested migration routes, patterns of movement. If she studied it long enough, maybe she could predict where they'd emerge next, where they'd congregate. Knowledge was survival, always had been. As she worked, the fever continued to build. Her hands shook, making the drawings messy. Sweat dripped onto the paper, smudging the ink. But she kept going, driven by the need to record, to document, to leave something behind that might help the next person, if there was a next person. When she'd copied everything she could from the large tablet, Maya moved to the smaller ones, trying to decipher their meanings. Some seemed to be records of sightings, dates and locations marked with those same symbols. Others showed anatomical drawings, details of the creatures' bodies that suggested study, observation. The people here hadn't just feared these things. They'd tried to understand them. One tablet in particular caught her attention. It showed a creature that had been killed, injured. It was hard to tell, but the image depicted something wrong with its body. Segments separated, the limbs twisted, and beside it was a symbol she'd seen before. Fire. Fire. The creatures reacted to fire. It made sense. If they lived in deep tunnels, they'd be adapted to darkness, to cold, to environments without flame. Fire would be alien to them, dangerous, something to avoid, which meant fire was a weapon. Maya looked at her supplies. She had a lighter, one of the few modern tools she'd managed to keep. Fluid was almost gone, maybe enough for a dozen lights. But if she could find fuel, if she could create a torch or a firebrand, she might have a chance to drive them away, to make herself threatening rather than prey. It wasn't much, but it was something. She spent the rest of the day in the ruins, moving from building to building, searching for anything useful. She found fragments of pottery, tools corroded beyond recognition, and in one structure, a cistern that still held water. The water was stagnant, green with algae, but she filtered it through cloth and added it to her canteen. It tasted foul, but it was liquid. It would keep her alive. By evening, she'd compiled a list of resources: water, stone for tools, dried plant matter that might burn, no medicine, no food beyond some dried-out roots that were probably poisonous, but enough to work with, enough to try. Maya chose one of the more intact buildings as her shelter, wedging the door shut with stones. Then she settled in for the night, her wounded leg propped up, her notebook open beside her. She'd filled dozens of pages now with observations, sketches, theories, a record of everything she'd learned. If she died here, maybe someone would find it. Maybe it would help them survive where she'd failed. But she wasn't dead yet. The night brought the usual cold, and with it, sounds. Distant at first, that now familiar breathing sound, carried on the wind, then closer, then very close. Maya gripped her knife and waited, listening. The sounds circled the building, moving from one side to another, testing, searching, but the creatures didn't try to break in. Eventually, the sounds faded, moving off toward the canyon. When dawn came, Maya forced herself outside. Her leg was worse. She could barely put any weight on it now. The fever had intensified, leaving her lightheaded and nauseous, but she had to move. Staying here meant slow death from infection or starvation. Moving meant the chance of finding help, however slim. She gathered what supplies she could carry, including several of the stone tablets that showed creature patterns. They were heavy, awkward, but they were knowledge, and knowledge was survival. Then she began walking again, using her knife as a crutch, heading west, because west was the only direction that made sense. The ruins fell behind her, swallowed by the desert, and ahead, somewhere beyond the horizon, lay whatever came next. The desert stretched on, indifferent to her struggle, heat and stone and sand, endless and hostile. But Maya had survived it this long. She'd survived the creatures, the thirst, the infection. She'd survived isolation and despair, and moments of pure terror. She'd survive this too, because that's what she did. That's who she was. A survivor in the dark desert, walking toward an uncertain future with nothing but will and knowledge and the stubborn refusal to give up. And if the creatures wanted to test that will, they'd learn what the people of the ruins had known, that humans might be soft, might be slow, might seem easy prey, but they didn't give up. They didn't stop. They studied and adapted and found ways to fight back. The ground ahead began to buckle again, sand rippling in familiar patterns. Maya stopped, watched, waited. Another one was coming up. But this time, she didn't run. She pulled out her lighter, flicked it open. The flame was small, barely visible in the harsh sunlight. But it was there, real, dangerous. The creature emerged, smaller than the others, perhaps 10 feet long. Its sensory organs swiveled toward her, and for a moment, human and creature regarded each other across the empty desert. Then Maya held up the flame. The creature recoiled, its limbs pulling in, its body contracting. The organs swiveled away, refusing to look at the fire, and after a long moment, it retreated, sliding back down into its tunnel, disappearing into the earth. Maya watched it go, then looked at the tiny flame in her hand. Such a small thing, such a simple weapon, but effective. She smiled, despite the fever, despite the pain, because she'd learned something new. And in the desert, Each new piece of knowledge was a victory. The lighter clicked closed. Maya adjusted her grip on her makeshift crutch and continued walking west. Behind her, the ground settled. Ahead, the desert waited. And somewhere in between, a woman with an infected leg and a notebook full of observations walked toward tomorrow, carrying the weight of survival on her shoulders. Because giving up wasn't an option. It never had been. The desert would test her again. The creatures would return. The challenges would multiply. But she'd face them. All of them. One step at a time. If you want to witness more journeys through the hostile desert, more encounters with what lurks beneath the sand, subscribe to Dark Desert Survival. And tell me in the comments, what moment of Maya's journey shocked you the most? Was it the creature emerging from the canyon wall, or her discovery in the ancient ruins?